So, why doesn't rest always restore the brain? We tend to assume if you rest, you recover. But that isn't always true. Sometimes the opposite happens. A calm day can leave the brain more exhausted than a demanding one. No pressure, no urgent tasks, no overload, and still, the fatigue remains. Why? Why doesn't the brain switch off after rest? Why does it keep working even when you've already stopped? What exactly is still unfinished? And why doesn't rest close that process? There is an answer, and it's not a soft one. Rest does reduce load. When you stop, the brain stops spending energy on action. But the brain doesn't get tired only from action. It gets tired from what remains unresolved. And this is the shift. Rest doesn't solve that. Sometimes it makes it worse. You stop, and the brain speeds up. Not outside, inside. It tries to finish what's still open. That's why, after rest, you can feel worse, not better. And if you don't understand this, you'll keep trying to rest more and get the same result. To understand why, we need one mechanism. It's called prediction error. Rest reduces load. That part is true. When you stop, the brain stops spending energy on action. It seems like that should be enough, but it isn't. And here's the first paradox. The body calms down. The brain doesn't. At that same moment, a different kind of work begins. Quieter, less visible, but not weaker. Sometimes even stronger. And that's the problem. This work doesn't stop automatically. Some processes don't close on their own. They stay active, and the brain keeps returning to them. Again and again, even when you've already stopped. That's the second paradox. Rest removes action, but it doesn't remove the internal task. And this is where most people get it wrong. The brain doesn't work only with the present. It is constantly building predictions, trying to work out what comes next. Always. During work, during conversation, even in stillness. And sometimes one of those predictions never gets completed. It's as if a process started, but no final answer ever arrived. And then a gap appears. The loop stays open, and the brain can't close it. So it keeps it active. Not because it wants to think, but because it never got a result. And here's the key point. As long as the loop is open, the brain won't let go. It keeps coming back, checking, comparing, trying to complete the model. Even during rest, that's why the fatigue stays, not because of load, but because of unfinished processing. And in neuroscience, that's what we call prediction error. Intuitively, you'd expect this. If something is draining, the brain should just shut it down. But it doesn't. And that isn't a flaw. It's a strategy. Here comes the next paradox. The brain keeps prediction error active on purpose, not by accident, not out of inertia, because to the brain, it matters. Why? Because prediction error is not just an error, it's a signal that reality didn't match expectation, that the model was inaccurate, that something didn't go the way it was supposed to. And for a system organized around survival, that becomes a priority. Always. Even if, objectively, nothing dangerous is happening, the brain doesn't know that yet. It only sees one thing, a mismatch. One outcome was expected. A different one happened. The system marks the gap, automatically. This needs to be explained, not ignored, not postponed. Explained. And until that explanation appears, the signal stays active. This is where most people misread what's happening. They think the brain is stuck. It isn't stuck. It's working. It's checking, comparing, updating the model, trying to reduce the error. Again and again. Until it gets an answer it can trust. And here's the critical part. The calmer the external world becomes, the more visible this gets, because resources are no longer being spent on action. So the brain turns inward. That is why, during rest, you often start thinking more, not less. Not because something is wrong with you, but because the system finally has room to return to what was left unresolved. And this creates the core conflict. You are trying to rest, but the brain intensifies its work. Not external work, internal work. And until the system finds an explanation, prediction error remains active. Even if you're lying on the couch, even if you're on vacation, even if you've decided to do nothing, the brain does not organize itself around your intention to rest. It organizes itself around what is still unresolved. And until that task is closed, it does not let go. That's why rest, by itself, sometimes doesn't work. Not because rest is weak, but because it doesn't solve the main problem. For the brain, the task is still open. If prediction error creates load, the obvious assumption is this: the brain should close it as quickly as possible. And sometimes it does. A signal appears and disappears. An explanation is found. The loop closes. The brain moves on. No tension. But sometimes that doesn't happen. The signal stays, and the brain keeps returning to it again and again. Why? Because not all errors are equal, and that matters. To the brain, there are low priority signals and high priority signals. The first kind closes quickly. The second kind doesn't. If a mismatch looks potentially important, the brain raises its priority, and everything changes. The signal is no longer released. It's held, rechecked, rebuilt. And this is where the real load begins. Now the next paradox. Sometimes a signal stays open not because the brain can't solve it, but because it does not want to close it too early. From the outside, that looks like getting stuck. But it isn't a malfunction. It's caution. The system is effectively saying, stop. There isn't enough information yet. It's too early to commit to a conclusion. So instead of closing the loop, it keeps the signal active. It continues to compare, observe, test new input, and that costs energy, even when nothing is happening outside. That's where this effect comes from. You are resting, but the brain keeps working. Not because it is overloaded, but because it is handling a high-priority, unresolved task, and that matters. These signals do not disappear on their own. They come back. Thoughts repeat. Questions linger. Situations replay, even in rest. And here the key factor is uncertainty. The higher the uncertainty, the longer the signal stays active. The less clarity there is, the more resources get consumed. And this is the turning point. The brain does not get tired mainly from volume. It gets tired from being unable to close the loop. That is why uncertainty can be more exhausting than the workload itself. And this is where the shift begins. If the real problem is uncertainty, then recovery is not always about rest. Sometimes the fastest way to reduce the load is not to stop. It is to clarify. The intuitive assumption is simple. If the brain is tired, it needs more rest, more pauses, more time. But sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes one decision is enough, and the whole state changes. Abruptly. As if the load just vanished. Even though you barely rested. And that isn't an illusion. It is a real shift. And here we reach the strongest paradox in the entire video. The brain can recover faster from clarity than from rest. Why? Because rest does not solve the main task. It removes load, but it doesn't close the signal. Clarity does. It gives the system what it was missing, an answer. And in that moment, something critical changes. Prediction error stops being active. The system detects alignment. The loop closes. And with that, the load drops. Not gradually, immediately. And here is the deeper point. The brain was holding that signal not because it was unable to let go, but because it was not allowed to let go yet. Without clarity, any conclusion is unreliable and therefore potentially dangerous. This is the central neuroparadox of the whole video. The brain keeps prediction error active not because it is overloaded, but because it is protecting you. It refuses to close the loop until it is confident that the model makes sense. That is why certain states don't release. Thoughts come back. Decisions get postponed. Not because you are weak, but because the system still treats the task as unfinished. And then comes the turning point. The moment clarity appears, even minimal clarity, the system gets an answer. Not a perfect one, a sufficient one. And in that moment, priority drops. The signal closes, and the load falls sharply, sometimes within seconds. That is why, in real life, something that sounds strange turns out to be true. One precise insight or one real decision can restore the brain faster than hours of rest. If the brain is tired, that does not always mean it is overloaded. More often, it means something is still open. So the question changes. Not, how do I rest? But, what is still unresolved? Step 1. Find the signal. Not everything at once. One thing. What keeps returning to your mind? You try to rest. The thought comes back. That is the signal. Step 2. Make it precise. Vague doesn't close. Not, I need to figure this out. But, what exactly is unclear? Or, what decision has not been made? Until the signal has a clear form, the brain will keep the loop open. Step 3. Reduce uncertainty. Don't do more. Make it clearer. Minimally. Choose an option. Define a decision. Identify the next step. Example 1. Work. You are resting, but one thought keeps returning. I need to do something about work. That is not the signal. That is noise. The actual signal sounds more like this. I still don't know whether I'm staying or leaving. Then you define. I'll decide on Friday at 6 p.m. after I speak with X. And the tension drops. Not because the problem is solved, but because uncertainty has been reduced. Example 2. Relationships. You are resting, but inside there is this feeling. Something is wrong. That is not the signal. That is background tension. The signal becomes clearer as, I don't know whether he is pulling away or whether I'm overinterpreting. Then you define, I'll ask directly tomorrow evening. And the state changes. Because the signal became specific. Now notice what matters. In neither case did the external situation change. The problem did not disappear. No final solution was reached, and yet the state changed. Why? Because one thing changed. The signal became clear. A next step appeared, and the system stopped holding everything open at once. Step 4. Close it sufficiently, not perfectly. A perfect answer keeps the loop open. A sufficient answer closes it. Sometimes this is enough. I'll come back to this tomorrow at 10. And the brain releases it. Step 5. Check. There's a simple test. If the tension drops, the loop is closed. If it doesn't, you haven't identified the real signal yet. Go back to step 1. The brain does not get tired mainly from load. It gets tired from unfinished loops. Rest doesn't always restore the brain, because the issue isn't rest. Energy does not return when you stop. It returns when uncertainty drops. As long as the signal stays open, the brain will keep it active, even during rest. And now, the important part. If you have ever felt this, then you have already seen it. The state does not change because of the pause itself. It changes at the moment something inside finally comes together. But that raises the next question. What exactly has to come together? What is happening in the brain at that moment? Why is there conflict one moment and none the next? How does the brain choose one version of reality over another? Why does the conflict disappear? And why does that instantly change the way you feel? In the next video, we'll look at the mechanism that does exactly that. How the brain reduces conflict, how it selects a model, and why that is what actually brings energy back. What actually restores the brain.